Hi, so this week for my discussion topic, I was assigned the Israel-Palestine conflict that began in 2023. So I'm going to start out by discussing our groups that we have within this conflict. So our dominant groups are going to obviously be Israeli citizens and then Palestinian citizens. Now, within those two groups, those are really just territories that are occupied. So those are citizens within, but there's definitely groups within those territories as well. So for our Israeli citizens, they are the people who live in the state of Israel. Now, our Palestinian citizens, those are going to be the citizens that live within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So their territories are a little bit more confusing in verbiage because there isn't just like a Palestinian state, if you will. So some subgroups, mainly the subgroups that we hear of when we're talking about this conflict are Palestinian subgroups. So there are two main ones. The first one is the Fatah, and they are a more peaceful group between the two. They are part of the nationalist group within the Palestinian Authority, which governs part of the West Bank. So they really only kind of govern part of the Palestinian territory. And now the other one is one that we hear a lot of if you're familiar with this conflict, is the Hamas. They are a militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, and they really are they're pretty violent, pretty hostile, and they really just reject any of Israel's right to exist. They just essentially want Israel territory to just no longer be a thing. So Israel has some subgroups that are just not really talked about as strongly. They do kind of have a left and a right group, like is talked about here in the States. Their left and right groups are one is wanting a peaceful conclusion. They're willing to agree to a two-state situation where Palestine has their territory and Israel has their territory. And then the other is really wanting to continue on with the war at hand, and they're wanting to basically squash any Palestinian territory. So those are kind of our big situations. But like I said, the Palestinian subgroups are mostly talked about here. So in Israel, they're mainly Jewish citizens, while Palestine is made of Arab, Muslims, and Christians. The Jewish citizens are mainly of European, Middle Eastern, and African descent, while the Palestinians are mainly of Arab descent. So those are kind of our two categories. And then within these territories, it's a pretty closed system. There's not a whole lot of movement throughout them. In the Israel territory, the Jews had the higher status than any of the Arabs. So any Palestinian refugee that has sought refuge in Israel, it's not super common for them to, but there are some that have. They're definitely looked down on and kind of seen as a lower class than the Jewish citizens. And then that's kind of it for that. In Palestine, there isn't really a whole lot of, there's just a lot of poverty. That's pretty much just like completely across the board. There really isn't a lot of, they're living in poverty, especially in the Gaza Strip where there is all of the war being waged right now. That's where most of the violence is taking place. They are all living in poverty, essentially. It's a very rough place to be. Now there has been decades of violent interactions between Israel and Palestine. So essentially what happened was they were divided into two states, and Israel got the bulk of the land, and Palestine only got, like I said, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And because of that, there's kind of always been some riots and some uprising, and there's been multiple wars. And now this one is kind of like the big explosion at this point. Like things have just built up, and now they're at the point where it's hard for them to come to a conclusion here. They're really having a hard time making any peace. All peace that has made in the past has kind of just been like band-aid things. Nothing that's really put an end to it. So as with any war that happens, many human rights have been violated. So kind of the biggest ones that have been violated are the right to no torture, the right to no discrimination, and then the right to nationality. Those are kind of just a few. Now, the Hamas group that I had mentioned before, they have taken a lot of hostages. So anyone who's kind of followed this conflict has probably heard of that situation where there has been a lot of Jewish citizens that have been taken and are now being held hostage by the Hamas. And the biggest kind of negotiations that are happening right now are just hostage release negotiations. So that right to no torture has kind of been a huge one that's been happening over there. And then since the current conflict started in 2023, like I said, the Palestinians are basically living in poverty. Their poverty rate has increased astronomically. And since Gaza is where almost all of this is taking place, it's just really destroyed. And so most Palestinians are seeking refuge in other countries, and it's been really rough. There's been a lot of death, and they've been hit really hard. Now, Israel really hasn't been hit as much, so their citizens really aren't seeing much of an economic decline from this war. They were pretty solid to begin with, and they've continued to be really solid. They have a lot of technology that really kind of helps them. They do, within their socioeconomic statuses, they really differ based on ethnic and religion affiliations. So like I said, they're mainly of Jewish faith. However, within that, there's a lot of different Jewish practices. And so based on what kind of Jewish faith that you do practice is going to kind of rank where you're at. Now, any Palestinian citizen that has sought refuge in Israeli territory, they are lower class immediately. They are very much looked down on by any Israeli citizen. So that's something that's just across the board, doesn't matter. Some movements that have sparked, they've kind of been, like I said, this is conflict that's been happening for decades. So they've been movements that have been happening in the background this entire time, but now they've really kind of taken a big rise. So the Free Palestine movement is the biggest Palestinian one, and that claims to defend and advocate for the human rights of all Palestinians. So just kind of like a broad Free Palestine. And then the Peace Now is the Israeli movement, and that is just advocating for peace throughout just all of this conflict. Another thing to note with this conflict, and I'm sure anyone who is on any kind of social media, I've seen it on Instagram, I've seen it on TikTok, there's been a lot of talk about this conflict just because of how much damage it's doing. And like I said, the Hamas group taking hostages has been a huge topic of conversation. And so you've probably seen a lot of people kind of take a stance one way or the other. And so social media has actually really affected this conflict and has kind of strayed some narratives. So that's something interesting to know about this one, is the misinformation that's out there and just people taking sides and starting social media movements has really affected this conflict. So overall, this has been a really interesting topic to learn about. It's something that, like I said, I'd heard a lot about on social media, but I didn't really understand the meat and potatoes of it. And so I really enjoyed getting to know a little bit more about what's going on in an area that I previously really knew nothing about. So thank you.